Welcome to the Products to Services podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome on the Products to Services podcast, the leading podcast for product as a service models. Today's conversations is for every finance professional navigating the shift from selling products to delivering outcomes. Product as a service is not just a pricing tweak, it's a business model transformation, which also makes it a financial transformation, of course. And to unpack that, we're joined by two of Europe's leading enablers in this space, Cyprian Bruck from Links4 and Martin Gruber from Findustrial. And we're also joined by Kurt Miller, CFO at Energy Partners, who's lived this transformation firsthand. And all three bring powerful product as a service experience as well as the investor side view to this conversation. And I'm very glad to have the three of you on the show. And could all of you start with a brief introduction from yourself and say who you are and what your companies are doing? Perhaps let's start with Kurt.
G'day everyone. As has been said, I'm Kurt Miller, the CFO at Energy Partners. And I think we're a business that focuses on sort of three core assets: cooling assets, heating assets, and refrigeration assets. I think we provide those assets on an outsourced basis. We invest, we own the assets, and we sell the output. We also have two other supporting businesses, namely an asset management business, which essentially runs the three assets, and then a data sustainability business as well. Thanks for the time.
Nice to have you here, Kurt. Cyprian, do you want to go next?
Sure. Cyprian Bruck. I'm co-managing director of Links4, responsible for technology and sales and marketing. And at Links4, we offer flexible financing for machinery across Europe. Our flagship product being a pay-per-use financing that has accounting advantages for companies. And also equally happy to be part of this conversation.
Great to have you here, Cyprian. Martin, over to you.
Hi, my name is Martin. I'm the founder of Findustrial. We are the operating platform of equipment as a service. And on top of that, we offer an international financing network that enables OEMs to fund their as a service journey. And I'm very happy to be here.
Great to have you here, Martin. So to summarize, three gentlemen that are experts in the financing world, with Kurt from Energy Partners being here to have the, let's say, the operator, the provider of equipment as a service model side, Cyprian with the financing, the actual financing of the assets hat on, and Martin, which is the platform that puts it all together in the back end. So I think this will lead to very interesting discussions here today. Let's start. If you had to describe the biggest finance challenges companies are facing when moving towards product as a service models in one sentence, so what is the biggest finance challenge? What would that be? Kurt, do you want to start?
I think for me, I don't necessarily see there actually being a finance challenge in our market. I think a lot of the funders are actually quite keen to fund the assets. But what I do see is our customers are almost unsure about taking a large CapEx asset and letting someone else design, construct, and actually, more importantly, operate the asset. So for me, that's really been key challenging in convincing clients that Energy Partners can assume the operational risk of running the asset.
Okay, so it's a trust challenge from a customer side, that they need to trust an external party as you to basically run their operations to a certain degree.
Agreed.
Okay.
Again, a lot of these assets are fully integrated into their, in some ways, industrial process. So now you're trusting another entity to obviously run those assets.
Okay, interesting. Cyprian, what is your take on this?
So it ties into what some large OEMs that we partner with say. So there's a certain degree of skepticism, especially in multi-billion dollar sale type size companies, whether or not equipment operators would trust a third party to, in your case, Kurt, to operate it, and in our case, to finance it. And so we sort of approach this trust gap with full service packages. So we finance not only the equipment, but also a mandatory service and maintenance contract that the OEM concludes with the operator, and then some add-ons potentially, but really because it creates an alignment of interest, right? So between the three parties, the OEM, us as a financier, and the operator. And service and maintenance obviously represents after sales services for the after sales revenues, for the OEM. For us, we have the certainty of a well-maintained asset in place for the 5, 6, 7 years of the financing term. And the operator gets peace of mind because no longer is their workforce needs to be up to date and certified and trained to do the maintenance, but there is this question of will they let an external party onto their shop floor to perform this maintenance? And where we see trouble, or for example, this being a very sensitive issue, is highly regulated or very conservative industries, like, for example, steel industry. If you think about a blast furnace, would they ever let an external maintenance company onto their premises to do this maintenance? So there's interesting questions that come up, but it does resonate what Kurt was saying in that there's a trust gap that needs to be addressed with equipment operators.
Interesting, Cyprian. Martin, do you have an opinion on this?
Yes, I do have an opinion on that, but I would like to look at that finance challenge from a different angle. I think Kurt and Cyprian looked at it from the big corporations. I would look at it from an SME or a scale-up standpoint. I think the biggest challenge there for sure is if they are launching their PaaS campaigns, that they quickly hit a so-called path growth ceiling, as we call it, where the balance sheet essentially starts to be limited. And if we listen to what Cyprian said, it's you need to find funding partners out there who are keen to look ahead of the actual balance sheet and of the operators, of the OEM's financial performance in the first place. So you need to look at the product, and you need to look at the product service package and make sure that you take the so-called who can operate the product service system instead of the manufacturer in a default case. So you need to value that in as well, so that people are able to launch their PaaS campaigns successfully. And what we see, a lot of these new tech companies in robotics, in heating, in energy, they struggle to really grow their PaaS campaigns because they would essentially run the whole operating system on product as a service, but they can't because they cannot just fire equity into hardware. And that's where we see a huge limitation and a big finance challenge for a successful product as a service.
Okay, interesting. So two main messages here. If I summarize, trust is the first key thing, where basically it's a model where the trust goes back from the customer back to the provider in a certain sense, right? And so customers need to challenge the provider again or an external party. And then Martin, what you said is, well, perhaps they do a first pilots from a SME or even a larger organization. They finance a first pilot with their own equity, but then when they need to scale this, then they're quite limited because they're more reluctant to pouring more equity, to pouring more cash into financing their own machines. And this is where you come in, right?
Exactly. Managing that a growth path is the key. And we've seen a lot of businesses being locked in because they've made early mistakes. And then a lot of financing partners essentially walk away and said, your balance sheet is limited and everything. We can't do anything after that now. So it's important that you are managing your ramp up properly, so that you're not hitting the growth ceiling too early. And it's important to choose the right partners in the right situation.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so great to have different players in the market, and you have players such as Links4 who has a specific positioning in the market, and they completely differentiate to traditional leasing companies, and enable a transition in a moment where others wouldn't be able to help. So
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
good.
I think one overestimated thing when we talk with different manufacturers is that to a certain degree, the manufacturer becomes a fleet operator. And so they become an investment company to a certain degree, right? Where it's their own fleet of assets out there, which they need to manage in the best way possible. So this is a big paradigm shift. It's not just a pricing tweak. Divided by 60 and spread it over 5 years, right? So it's a really different model with different responsibilities, with the service department gaining a lot more responsibility. So it's really a different business model. If we look over the last 5 to 10 years, in your opinion, has the role of the CFO changed because there's more and more recurring revenue models out there? Has the role of the CFO changed over the last 5 to 10 years? Kurt, perhaps?
I think in this sector, I think the CFO has more than just a financial reporting role. I mean, certainly in our case, we're signing long-term agreements, 20-year agreements. I think there's quite a legal contracting sort of engagement, which maybe in a traditional CFO role, I don't think you really, have as much contracting. So I think certainly in the outsourced sort of environment, there is quite a lot wider focus for the CFO that I think they need to engage with.
Okay, interesting. Cyprian?
Yeah, I'd agree with Kurt. I mean, I think CFO roles really vary from company to company, but certainly we're seeing this, and actually, I mean, it's a new theme in an old area of responsibility, right? Because the CFO also needs to influence the financing mix that a company chooses, and ultimately the capital structure they have, right? So the choice of leasing in general, right, and the switch from CapEx to OpEx is something that really needs CFOs to be on board with and understand across all manners of, let's say, lessees or equipment operators, right? For the OEMs, it's a slightly different sort of set of challenges. If you consider how Martin was explaining the OEM perspective, especially in the SME space, switching to a product as a service model in the business side requires, again, a very specific set of challenges for the financing of that growth path. So I think it really depends on which of the three sort of perspectives you occupy in the product as a service ecosystem.
Martin, something to add here?
Yes, there's one thing to add. What we've learned is, and I only look at the manufacturer's view here, initially it's important that the CFO doesn't stop the process. So this is the first thing that we need to make sure, and that's where it changed. They need to be open to a new concept initially. Second, and that's where it gets really interesting, when the model starts to grow, they need to have a system in place, a so-called operating system that gives them the security that they know what's happening. And I think without putting too much marketing behind Findustrial now, but that's where we come into play, because we see this a huge pain. We see that the CFOs essentially will be the stumbling block of a successful past campaign, because they essentially will get nervous. You have 50, 100, 200 projects out in a product as a service promise, with refinancing obligations in the background and potentially even flexible repayment structures with your customers. So what does that do? It does add a lot of potential risk and variability to your balance sheet. And the CFO, they need new instruments to be able to manage. So in short, yes, it does change and it has to change, but initially it's important that the CFOs are open to the journey, that they need to make sure that they're not saying no straight away because it's not the sell and forget business model anymore. As soon as they start the journey, they need some help that they haven't had before, and that the traditional systems that are in place would essentially not be able to handle.
Yeah, Martin, I mean, what all three of you said is very much resonating, because it needs to start with the vision that the CFO needs to have, right? It needs to have this long-term vision of kind of wanting to become the Netflix of their own industry, let's say. But then to make it actually happen, the hands get a lot dirtier than just, let's say, only computing a few Excel sheets and some formulas. There needs to be a real operating system behind it. The service department is super, super important, because in the end, it's not about selling more hours or more spare parts to them. It's about keeping the fleet of asset in the best shape possible and guaranteeing the highest level of performance possible. And for that, you need proper processes, proper platform behind that to make that work.
Florian, can I
Sure.
maybe just add? I think I completely also agree with Martin, in that I think if you're a traditional manufacturer, you obviously sold units, and not necessarily for long term, you sold it for short term. So I think if you have the right CFO function in place, where I think the contracting side, data, and the financial sort of corporate structure can be properly integrated. I think that is what certainly has helped us as a business, some ways catapult out of a pure manufacturer focus into more of an investment focus as well. So yeah, for me, actually the right CFO function, I think, can actually help this growth journey, because I don't think there's a lot of manufacturers that can combine the other aspects that you require in actually owning the asset for long term, and then having the right contracting environment where you're signing a 10, 15, 20-year contract, and you're now going to take a credit view, not just I'm going to run the asset, but a credit view on the client that you're signing, so that you can get appropriate funding. And then all of this also needs to be, obviously you need to run the plants well, and you need to report well. So yeah, I think, again, if you have the right team that can go beyond just, I'm going to put up a plant and I'm going to sell it to you and it's for cash, I think that is what can help, catapult a manufacturer.
Which goes all in the direction of, in the end, you're building partnerships together with your customers, right? It's not about you trying to sell as many units as possible out on the market. It's about choosing the right customers, choosing the right high quality products, having a service department in there, and having the whole financing capability as a backbone to basically, sign long-term contracts with your customers, sticky contracts that are not going to churn, that are not going to fail because you've done the proper due diligence from them. So it's the most beautiful way of doing business, right? As a service model. It's not about selling as much as possible.
I'm in agreement, but I think it highlights just how big a paradigm shift it is, because cash transactions, we've been doing for thousands of years, and they have a certain anonymity, right? It doesn't matter who pays you cash, right? Anybody who's willing to pay the list price can have your product.
Okay, that's sounds like a lot on the plate. You started 15 years ago to offer as a service models at Energy Partners. What started this? Why did you start going towards as a service?
Well, I think firstly we saw in South Africa that there was quite a spike in the electricity prices. And the view was that, for on the one side, if there's a spike in electricity prices, and a lot of the technologies that operate on a client site is often electricity driven. It's an outcome. Electricity is an input into running a lot of the plants. if you've got an engineering business and you've got this electricity sort of price challenges, and you know you can run things more efficiently than what a client can, and you've got a financial backing to actually own the assets. I think we just saw that puzzle coming together. And then, yeah, I think that's how the business grew. But as I also said, we started more actually in some ways as an investment business. But if you don't have the pipeline of deals, you also, you obviously then can't close out deals. So we needed to then again find the manufacturing elements so that, that's where our pipeline came from. And then you link that with obviously the investment option as well.
Okay, so step by step you build this, but you finance this yourself with injecting your own capital and then having bank-backed financing, and then over the years you grew this slowly. So by the way, for all the listeners here, we also had a conversation with Dawi Creel, which is the general manager of the cooling division at Energy Partners, which was the first episode that we published. So if interested in that, you can go have a listen to that. Can you share some numbers, Kurt, on Energy Partners? I know that it's more than 100 million euros of assets under management today. Any other numbers that you can share?
I think maybe I'll more just focus on the number of assets that we are running in the business. This was probably at least 60 power assets, where we run sort of power plants. But then in total, we have more than 80 power, cooling, and heating assets. And the other 20 assets is really split between the cooling and heating assets. And these are generally large-scale industrial systems that we run on a client site. But as you said, it's more than $100 million that we're running. Yeah, and then I can talk a little bit later about the finance journey as well, because it wasn't straightforward where we got bank funding from the start. Certainly not during almost the construction phase of a project. I think that was really the big challenge for us when we started going down this journey.
I think that would be interesting because at the end of the conversation with Dawi, he mentioned that if back then he would have known that there would be other enablers, partners that could have helped on the journey of scaling as a service, perhaps it wouldn't have taken, if I may say, that long, and you would have be able to scale a bit faster. Can you share on that journey?
Yeah, I think we fortunately had a very strong private equity investor, who's actually still investing in the business, and they really seeded the business to fund the initial sort of on balance sheets assets that we had on an outsourced basis. And we struggled to get construction finance, as I said, for that initial phase. So it was initially equity financed. And once the asset was commissioned and obviously the performance was proved, could we then move it into long-term finance? But even, when we moved it into long-term finance, there was various credit hurdles that we needed to move through. So it took a little bit of time to almost, in some ways, finance all the assets that we had funded on balance sheet. Fortunately, after proving that you can build good assets and that you can run these assets at the right efficiency levels, we managed to get one of the asset managers in South Africa that actually funded us for some of our assets on a construction basis. So we got a small construction facility in place, which again helped us on the journey. It was a little bit expensive, but it at least meant that in our first phase of development, we had some equity. We essentially got that refinanced. And as part of the refinance, we obviously used that available cash with our construction facility to now do our next group of assets. And as the journey went on, we eventually found two other key sort of funders in the market. And they essentially then gave us a combined construction and long-term facility. And as time went on, we actually just in some ways improved the model. Firstly, it was an amortizing profile, which again we would then refinance on a regular basis, to the point now where we almost have an interest-only facility, which amortizes at a point. But I think your capital drag is limited because you now only have your interest payments, which I think just helps your cash flow position. So it was a little bit of a journey. Initially owned capital,
But
a
can
little
I
bit of construction finance, and I think improving the model as we went along.
Can I add one thing, Florian? I think the one thing that was really interesting was the fact that your energy projects are always linked to an outcome that the end customer is they understand it easy because essentially you are offering them a proposition that they can compare straight away with their energy bill at the moment. And this is what we see as well. It's where you can combine outcome with OpEx costs that the customer already has. The selling pitch is easy. When you are struggling to do that, the selling pitch is hard. Because what we've seen in the traditional manufacturing space, for example, is if you are trying to sell a CNC machine an hour, you will find out that end customers do not 100% know how much they pay now. And a lot of customers don't even know how much they should charge now to their customers. So essentially, you are touching the base on you're trying to sell something, but the one who should actually buy it doesn't know is this good or is this bad. But in energy, they know straight away this is good because I'm paying 15 cents per kilowatt hours now. And if I get it for 12, really good deal, I'd rather do it. So this is one key learning we had as well in the last months is wherever you can compare outcome with the operational expenditure that the customer has at the moment, you have a sweet spot. That's where you can.
I think, and Martin, even, to take that further, if you have a cooling solution, which is driven by electricity, you can actually do that same comparison. So if they run a cooling plant, and it uses a certain number of kilowatt hours, but what we say is we can do it better than them. Because this is we've got the engineers that run these cooling plants. So if they run it at a certain level, we're going to run it lower. So then you times the same kilowatt hour rate, but now the savings comes in that we are going to use less electricity at your same rate. And then if you add on top of that, the fact that we can add a power solution, you actually then have a double benefit as well.
So it really comes down to essentially doing total cost of usership or total cost of ownership comparisons with, okay, this is an assessment of how you're doing it at the moment. Do we agree on this? And this is how we suggest you can do it and save over time without dispensing any cash, right? But essentially it comes down to this total cost of ownership calculations. On the other side, what we have seen with a lot of manufacturers, when they talk about total cost of ownership with their customers, they usually the fights start happening because they don't calculate downtime and risks in the same way, right? So I don't know, Martin, Cyprian, if you've come across those type of discussions as well.
So yeah, all the time, right? Because when we underwrite utilization risk, which is kind of a core competence, key decision that needs to be taken is what is the billing unit, right? And as both Kurt and Martin mentioned, operating hours is a default, but it's a bit of a fluffy concept because, on the shop floor, are you talking about the machine on hours? Is it actual welding time or, where something is actually being done of consequence? So that's a little bit more tricky. Where we find, pay-per-use to really work is where the outcome equals not just a cost, as Martin pointed out, but can be a revenue source, right? And so our poster child here is our paper wash program that we've built with OEM partner WashTech, which is one of the leading manufacturers of car washes. So portals, tunnels, etc. And the proposition is very simple. Car drives in, you charge the client 10 euros, and you get a clean car as an outcome. And then that's their tagline, clean cars. And so if we can turn the investment into a portal or a tunnel into €2.50 for a wash, plus 50 cents for the service and maintenance and 40 cents for the chemicals, all that the operator is left is electricity, some water, and some personnel. And they can get the entire revenue generating asset for €3.50 onto their site. And this is where the power of pay-per-use or, product as a service really hits home, where that outcome is associated with some revenue, and you can summarize this all into a full service package.
Yeah, this is really what you see in the successful models out there, whether it's Heidelberger Druckmaschinen, which is selling printers, which basically in turn generate revenues for the printing companies, whether it's Rolls-Royce with the turbines of the engines that sell flight tickets, whether it's Michelin that is selling driven kilometers instead of selling tires, where basically they charge, the transportation company charges the Amazon or whoever is delivering the packages, but they're all models that are successful, which are either, as you said, Cyprian, revenue generating factors, or, but I would add also core capabilities to make the customer's processes work. And I'm looking at you, Kurt, Energy Partners. I know that you worked with Dr. Oetker that is selling, amongst others, frozen pizzas. Well, if they're not frozen, there is no business case for them, right? So you're not directly a revenue generating factor, but you're so core to their operations that without you guys, the pizzas would go bad.
Agreed. 100%. Yeah, that's one of our clients. Dr. Oetker. Maybe if I can just add a different point, is for a manufacturer going in this alternative offering is to really make sure one understands the risk that you are taking on in terms of how you are pricing. Because I think if I just take, one of our technologies, cooling, can price based on supplying cooling into the back of a refrigeration system. That's the one model. Versus measuring, let's say, pricing the cooling within a refrigeration in a fridge, which is less within our control, because you can't control in a retail store when a fridge door gets left open or closed. So again, making sure one clearly understands, if you're pricing something a certain way, that you really clearly understand the risk that you're taking on. So we weren't comfortable taking on the risk of cooling. It's in a retail, on the side of the retail store, where again, closing and opening a door is not in our control. We can be on the back end, because that's really the risk that we can control.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's also what we look at when we assess larger production lines. So again, if it's an individual machine, it's fairly simple because, it's encased. There's a control unit. There's, a sort of manipulation proof data that this control unit will sort of expose. But in production lines, so we're working with a big mine in Austria, and they produce, 100,000 tons of material. And this needs to be bagged and then put on pallets. And we are charging them per pallet. So we need to be sure that none of the material can be bypass this process, and it's, a secure outcome that we're using to determine the usage, right? So I think your analogy with fridge door open works really well, because is there a risk of leakage that is outside, our control, and how manipulation proof is that outcome that we're using for our revenue pricing, right?
Which brings it to data and monitoring. I'm wondering how you guys, the discussions that you're having with your customers, because what we hear all the time is, well, we could digitize our equipment, but our customers, especially the very large ones, no way that they grant access to having about the equipment, how the health of the equipment is doing. How do you respond to this?
I think in sort of Central Europe, Germanic countries, there's an elevated sense of sort of data privacy, particularly in Germany, sort of in decades past, from computer science starting, and the hacker culture, data privacy is held in high regard. I think it's overdone a lot, and I'm more of a pragmatic Anglo-Saxon, I'm going to say, in that regard, where I wouldn't go as far as in the United States where the user of a phone is basically the product for all the tech companies because they just take all the data without asking if you want. But there's too much sensitivity around this data, right? Because the equipment produces potentially thousands of data points. For a pay-per-use financing, you need 10, 20, maybe 50, right? You need machine state, you need certain outcomes, connectivity. That's so. I think there's a big song and dance that a lot of people do it for other reasons because the fact on the matter on the ground is just limited data is sufficient, right? And shouldn't be such a big issue.
The network discussion is quite an intense one, and I completely agree that if you want to get access to their network, you have to separate it, and in most cases, this is the easiest path to avoid the discussions. I would like to add one last thing. You mentioned it. If a manufacturer has a digital service and they would like to monetize on the digital service. Why I'm in the business I'm in now is because I was managing a small manufacturing business in the UK for 3 years for an automotive company. And we tried the same thing. So we had coating machines and we had a so-called digital service to analyze the coating performance. And we tried to sell it to our clients and it didn't work. It was a mess. No one wanted to buy it, even though we knew that the coating performance would be better for the customers. We couldn't sell it. And we ended up, because of other reasons, we essentially ended up to build up an equipment as a service solution around that system. And we used that digital service to enhance our performance. Yeah. And we could increase our prices because of that. And now I'm telling you why I'm actually in the show of equipment as a service, or product as a service. It's because that changes the game. All the manufacturers who invested so much money in digitalization and digital services out there, I don't believe that only charging an additional digital service on top will be the game changer. It's enhancing your machine with digital products to make sure that your end customer has a better experience. That is the change. And you need to build that in your pricing model. If you're not, you don't believe in your product and in your digital service yourself. So I think this is exactly the point that always gets me enthusiastic. It's when manufacturers are starting to believe into their own products, because that essentially is the start of the journey.
Martin, it was nice to hear about the why of industrial and kind of where it comes from. Thanks for sharing this. I want to add something which goes in the same direction. I think equipment as a service gives your service and software teams purpose again, because they've been seen as, let's develop digital products, but in the end, no one pays for them. And this, as a person, on a human level, this is probably very frustrating, right? And this as a service model gives, again, more meaning to, okay, now we have to run our own assets in the best way possible, and gives more meaning to the software development team and incentivizes them to do a better job over time as well. Cyprian, I saw you kind of.
So I would agree that your tech team turns from a cost center into a profit center, right? And I would agree that 80% of people think this is a good thing because they feel their work is validated more. There are some percentage of people that don't like standing in the limelight and don't want to deal with external customers. And I say this as somebody who spent 10 years in technology and know just how many introverts are kicking around. They love building great technology and they will stand by the quality of their work, but they don't want to deal with an external customer. And if you are selling digital services, inevitably you need to face the music because the digital service is part of the offering. And so that's a bit of a mindset shift team. But I think, we've all, I see smiles here and Martin and Kurt. So it sounds like you've had a similar experience.
Kurt, something to share here?
No, I agree. I think if I look at let's say the product team, going, this sort of outsource service route actually could almost be a little bit of a push for them as well, because they don't need to just come in with the best price to get the deal. They actually can build the best plant, obviously with cost parameters being taken into account. But if we're going to own an asset and run it for 20 years, we don't want the cheapest plant. We want the plant that's going to run for 20 years so that in 5 years' time, we don't have to replace half the equipment or 10 or so on. So I think even again for our engineering, our product teams, it is actually a little bit of a different mindset, which I think lifts their minds as well. Because now, I don't just need to come in at the lowest price. I need to build the right system for the client. Because again, you're not pricing necessarily in the same way. So maybe not focusing on the tech team, but more on the product team.
Interesting. I mean, unfortunately, we're nearing the end. And to close, I would like to zoom out between the three of you, Kurt, Cyprian, Martin. You shared a lot of very interesting insights. Amongst the three of you, you have enabled hundreds of millions of euros and hundreds of contracts in product as a service models out there. So for leading companies, for leading manufacturers out there that want to either start the shift towards as a service or that want to scale the shift towards as a service, from each of you, what is the one piece of advice you would give their teams, whether it's the CFO, the CEO, or other strategic leaders amongst those manufacturers? Starting with Kurt. No pressure.
I think for me, it's actually quite straightforward. It's just making sure you have the right team around you to step into this new area. As we said, it's not a sale that you can step away from. So you need to have the right stakeholders around you to take the next step, and obviously, and in that way, manage your risk. Legal, from a contracting point of view, engineering, finance, and data. I think, and there's probably many more, but it's not just now an engineering business manufacturing certain items. I think it's going to go a lot wider than that.
The scope of services and responsibilities increasing a lot. Martin?
I would go for trust in the capability of your products and build the business model around it. I think this is always what keeps me enthusiastic about the journey, and I see so much potential in Europe. Let's say only Europe, if the manufacturers start to trust in the longevity of their products and use that product as a service business model as their advantage, then the competitiveness of Europe will no longer be in question. I think this is, for me, I would give away to the listeners and make sure that you do that, because that's where most struggling.
Yeah, Martin, I think that's a very good point, the competitiveness point, because let's say European manufacturers, Western manufacturers are always going to be more expensive than lower cost manufacturers. And it's perhaps the only way out to stay competitiveness and to stay relevant in the long run. So I'm completely with you on that point. Cyprian, to close?
Agree 100%, right? Cannot overemphasize the fact that adopting subscription models, product as a service, is a key road to staying competitive here on the continent. Again, that's a narrow European view of sure other companies in other regions will want to be better than European companies, and fair play. I think that it's, if there's one thing to take away for OEM is to just get started, right? It's a journey to transform to an as a service offering. It requires many different parts of the business and organization to come along for the ride. Yeah, I think I'll plug Martin because he refrained from doing it. I think Findustrial have got an amazing platform to accompany OEMs on that journey, and check them out.
Thank you for sharing this. I think the mentality also of companies to just get their start, as you said, and kind of get their hands dirty is important, and to see this as a startup within an SME or a startup within a large corporation, and just trial and error, get their hands dirty, get the first pilots out there, learn from it as fast as possible, and then find your way through it. The good news is that there is hundreds of companies that have done it already, manufacturers that are scaling successfully with as a service models. There's plenty of best practices of the do's and don'ts. At P2S, we see a lot of them. There's a few financing structures that you can play with. There's a few pricing structures that you can play with. Those are the 47 clauses that need to be written in your SLA. So there's a lot of best practices out there. Get inspired, talk to those that are doing it. I think, Kurt, I know at Energy Partners, you're always very open also to share interesting information on how you've done it. So surround yourself by people that have done it already in the past. Thank you for the listeners out there that tuned in. So if you would like to explore more, to hear more stories, I invite you to follow the Product to Services podcast, to visit our website, but to visit the website of Findustrial, of Links 4, of Energy Partners as well, to connect with the four of us. We will put the contact details in the description of the episode. And I say, see you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Products to Services podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe and listen to the other episodes. You can also follow us on our platforms to stay up to date. See you next time.